Make sure it's sending. Okay. All right. And we are live with a special edition of the Clean Power Hour, I guess. This is Eric Meyer here, Generation Atomic, along with my friend Tyson Culver. The topic du jour is decarbonizing cannabis. We thought it's a special day for many people out there and the perfect time to have a conversation about that specifically. Tyson, why don't we just give you a chance to introduce yourself, say hi. I got a few slides here that kind of set the stage after that, and then we'll get into the conversation. Sound good? So
Yeah,
take it away.
sounds good. Okay, I'm Tyson Culver. I'm actually out of Austin, Texas. Yeah, we were going to talk a little bit about a film we just wrapped up called Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. It's slated for release on June 2nd on iTunes. So please, pre-order availability comes out in a couple weeks, and then you're able to purchase the full-on film on June 2nd. A little bit about the film. Over a 3-year period, we traveled 60,000 people. 60,000 miles, interviewed 50 people from 7 countries on 5 continents to tell the human story about electricity and explain why power equals power. We went all over. We went to Lebanon, India, Hong Kong, Iceland. We went to Puerto Rico 7 months after the hurricane, when the second major blackout hit, and we also hit New York and California, and of course, since it is 420, we hit Colorado, and we talked about weed. So it's a pretty high intensity consumption plant, and we'll talk about that a little bit today.
Amazing. Thank you for that. I did, as I was doing research for this episode here, I found out some surprising things, and I just threw a couple slides together to share with our viewers. So I'm going to just run through those real quick. And Tyson, at any point, if you want to hop in with color commentary, you're welcome to. All right, so I thought it might be good to first look at the state of legalization. We got 11 states in the U.S. that have legalized recreational, 33 medicinal, including my home state of Minnesota. But we see that 80% of the sales are still happening in the black market. Surprisingly, I wouldn't have called that. Yet the size of the industry is massive and continues to grow. We're looking at 12 billion in sales in 2019. The carbon cost. This is kind of the meat of our discussion here, right? How energy intensive is it really? Where does that energy come from? A couple things I found. Energy use estimates range between 6 and 580 kilowatt 580 kilowatt hours per kilogram for greenhouse growing, and that's more for indoor production. So obviously it depends on how dirty that electricity is, what your emissions are going to be. If you get all 5,000 kilowatt hours from nuclear and renewables, and then you're fine, right? Then you're only really worried about water at that point. But to put that in perspective, the comparisons they made for the grid mix in Colorado was that one joint was like running a light bulb for 25 hours straight, or the equivalent of making, brewing and producing a 24-pack of a beer. It said 8.5 liters in the article, but I converted it just for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, that stat on what is it? The single joint is running your lights for 25 hours straight.
Yeah.
Robert had that in his article today in Forbes, and that was one I hadn't seen. So it's kind of interesting, right? I think when it comes to weed in general, you're looking at probably the folks that are pro weed or agnostic about it typically are probably lean a little bit to the left and a little more environmentally conscious. And I wonder how do you resolve that conundrum of being an environmentalist that also wants to smoke a joint? Because do you feel comfortable leaving the lights on when you leave the house? So some interesting stats for sure.
Yeah, we had for our Illinois campaign, we actually we're discussing canvassing at the lines to the dispensaries, and like just when we were about to put that into place, the realities of the pandemic started to hit, and we thought, okay, this isn't a good idea. But I would have loved to have had that discussion, hundreds of times with people waiting in line. Probably a receptive audience, you'd think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, this is pretty much says the same thing as it does above. You can see I made these slides quickly. The one different part about this is outdoor versus indoor growing is roughly can be up like 400 times greater the carbon intensity, because you're not using the sun, and you also have to internally heat, and then I'm assuming hydroponics are part of that. There's HVAC requirements just in general that are a lot more energy intensive. It makes sense.
Well, it's interesting too. What we found, I saw a question up here, is how did LEDs affect the industry? So we talked to a lot of pot growers, both legal and folks on the black market. And especially when you're talking to the old school folks, I mean, they're all about this, high pressure sodium lights. They say the bud is thicker. It's a better high, et cetera. But we also spoke to Fluence, which is actually out of Austin here, and they do LED lighting. And from what I understand, they're about 90% greater intensity and 90% more efficient. But if you say LED to an old school grower, they kind of scoff at it. So, and if you talk to the Fluence folks, they're like, listen, man, it's science. We're dialing into the color spectrum. It's science. So I don't know how it's actually impacted the industry. I know that when it comes to marijuana, growing marijuana, that your highest costs typically are your electricity costs. So I got to believe when it comes to the folks that are entrepreneurial, they're going to take a hard look at LED lighting, and if they're not already using it, just because it saves them a shit ton of money.
Right. Yeah. There definitely is a strong financial incentive. I wonder what the internal conversations at the utility companies are about this as well. So I'm sure they're well aware, and they're probably looking for people that are siphoning off electricity, as Robert Bryce's article today discussed. It'd be so much easier if we had a extremely low cost, extremely clean form of electricity, but I just don't know what that might be.
Right. Wouldn't it be great?
Yeah. Well, let's look at what Colorado's electricity mix actually is right now. I was curious. This is from the EIA data today, and they're not the best at charts. If I would have had some time, I would have massaged this into something a little prettier, but you can see that dominated by fossil fuels, coal, natural gas. Stack those two bars on top of each other, and it's probably way out here versus the hydroelectric and non-hydroelectric renewables. I also wish they would split out biomass in here, because that's such a way to goose the numbers, and Europe does it all the time.
You got a note here saying, are you trying to share your screen? I can't see it either. I don't know if there's a way that you're sharing the screen.
Yeah. So we have a couple people in the chat here. If you guys want to see the screen share, you actually have to watch it on Facebook or YouTube. Yeah. Cool. Just because when I get another monitor, then I might be able to do both at the same time. But because of the way the live streaming stuff works, I can't. So I'm sorry. It's to verbally show it to you. It's clear that it's mostly coal. The majority is coal, with 2,000 megawatt hours produced in the last year, followed by natural gas at about 1,500, and then finally combining all the non-hydro renewables at about 1,200. So just to give you a sense of the scale there. I wish I could show you. Maybe I can figure out how to do this real quick, because this next graphic I have shows all the different sources of where the emissions are coming from in the grow ops. It's and you add it all together, it's about 4,600 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of cannabis. So yeah, not good. I mean, that's at the same time, that's a fair amount of cannabis. I mean, that's 2.2 pounds. That would last a person quite a while, you'd think.
Yeah, depending on the severity of your bakedness.
Yeah, right. Yeah, let's see.
When we talked to Emily Bacchus, we got her on one of the clips that I shared with you. She was talking about was it the electricity intensity just to grow weed in Denver is growing on a year-by-year basis at 34%. It's increasing by 34%, just the amount of electricity they're needing to grow weed in Denver. And I think we talked about that one stat. It might be in the clip, it might not, but the electricity just to grow weed in Denver, the amount of electricity used is equal to that of the amount of electricity that the entire country of Burundi uses on an annual basis. So then I looked up the stats. I have it here. I think there are 727 people in Denver, and there are 11 million people in Burundi. So it's kind of, that's just baffling.
Oh boy. That's a big gap. I'm imagining that like a third world kid meme right now, where he's like, it's like, you're telling me that you use more electricity than my entire country does just to grow weed? I probably have to work that one up a little later in the week or something. Yeah, it is pretty remarkable, everything that goes into it. All right, so again, I'm sorry, Tyson, you don't get to see these slides, but the next one is kind of sort of what we've already talked about a bit, about what would go into decarbonizing cannabis, and LEDs, big piece of it. Vertical growing could be another aspect of increasing the water efficiency, the light efficiency potentially, depending on how things were angled. Greenhouses we already mentioned, but I think the biggest thing of all is cleaning up the electricity grid itself, because then you can kind of waste a little bit more. You don't have to be as efficient. I think that's the mindset that a lot of the environmental community is in right now, is kind of the opposite of, we need to cut back, etc. When you're making the film, I'm sure there's a lot of conversations about climate change and kind of philosophy around energy usage. What do you think can you describe kind of the timbre of those conversations, or any anecdote come to mind?
Well, I mean, there's a large segment of the population that is of the mindset of use less, do less, right? Just conserve. And I was in that group when we started the film. I mean, I don't come from the energy sector. If you would have told me 5 years ago that I was going to be doing a documentary about energy, I don't know how I would have responded, but I don't think it would have happened. But so I came into doing our film very much, 100% renewable advocate. I thought that was the way to go. I thought that was a natural kind of progression of, the energy landscape. Of course, we're going to do this because, we get energy from the sun and it produces so much, of course. And then over the course of time, I learned a great deal more about energy. But I can say the way I felt at the onset, and the way I perceived kind of like the energy conundrum that we all face today, like how much do you use? How much does that impact the environment? Am I doing my part? I think that's a common theme with a lot of folks. I think a lot of folks, are trying to do the right thing, and they're trying to use less or be more efficient, and just not be wasteful. And so you have this unfortunate tendency, especially with folks that have been in the energy sector for a long time, the folks that really know energy inside and out. I think that sometimes there's a frustration that so many folks just don't quite understand how energy grids work, that sometimes you run into experts that may say or do things that are just, I don't know, what's the best way of saying it? They're just frustrated that people don't really consider how much different things impact the environment. I'm sorry, it looks like I turned Siri on while I was talking to you there. And I think our goal in making our film was to make sure that no matter where you stood as it related to energy, whether you're on the left or you're on the right, because I am on the left and Robert, our star, is on the right, that no matter where you stood on the energy spectrum, that our movie would appeal to you. So we tried not to call anyone names, and we tried to talk to smart people across the spectrum. We talked to a lot of folks that didn't agree with each other. I think the one common ground that we found, and it comes out at the end of the film, is that by and large, I would say 95% of the people we spoke to all saw electricity as a human right. And that's what the basis of our film was kind of getting to, is we weren't pro or anti any one energy source. We were pro electricity and anti blackout. We were pro human. And so our film really tried to expose what energy poverty looked like. And when you talk about energy poverty, there are certain energy sources that really do come to the forefront, because when you're looking at energy, I think there's a trifecta that I've heard Bryce, Steve Rick, and a million other folks talk about. It's cheap, abundant, reliable, and if you got that, then your society by and large is doing pretty well.
Yeah. I really appreciated that about your film, because I think other films that maybe lumped into the same category don't explore the human impact aspect of it, especially in other countries around the world, or maybe if they do, it's about the potential impacts of climate change, not necessarily the impacts that are felt every day of not having access to energy, which are a lot more real and present to most people.
Yeah, it's not the existential threat that we constantly hear about. It's the real fucking threat that's going on right now. You know what I mean? And so it's Bryce had an article in the New York Post, I think last week or the week before, 1,300 reasons not to close down Indian Point. Mm-hmm. And it's because there's a whole, Bryce is really big on power density, how much land to create how much energy. The smaller the footprint, the less you take up nature, right? And so I boosted the post on Facebook, because it's, Forbes is a national publication. I want people seeing that and seeing this and, connecting the pieces together. And the vitriol, the commentary from the folks that are anti or pro nuclear, and once again, and even when you get the folks that really know energy, but they just get frustrated sometimes having conversations about energy, and this person saying, but Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile, and so it's like, it's having a conversation about energy, having a candid conversation about energy is a really difficult thing. And I'm sure you noticed in our film, we didn't say nuclear until minute 45. Yeah. And there was a reason for it. I didn't know the ending of the film, and I'm not going to say the ending of the film here, but I didn't know where we were going to go, because, I had to digest what everyone said, and we went back and forth on a million different things, and finally it's like, we got to say something about this thing right here, because it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room. I wish that I could a Clockwork Orange style seal the eyelids open and get so many people, maybe everybody at the climate talks to watch this, because it's become such a taboo that in many ways it's more palatable to condemn the poorest 1 billion to 2 billion people to a life of low energy or no energy than to even include nuclear in the discussion. I think the community, the pro-nuclear community has helped the broader environmental community kind of come along to this notion of we really do need to take a look at environmental justice and social justice and climate justice from a macro lens, because if we are myopic about the very real affronts that the nuclear weapons industry committed in the early days, uranium mining against Navajo Nation, or even, in my state in Minnesota here, not consulting with the communities that are nearby, the tribal communities that are nearby where nuclear waste is going to be stored. I'm worried that as a society, we have overweighted our concern about those things, which are justifiable, certainly, but weighed against so many people that are just struggling right now. I'm not sure that balance works out.
Yeah, the cost benefit analysis or the pros and cons of either. One of the latter interviews we did was with Jessica Lovering, and it was really helpful for me because I didn't understand as much about nuclear still. I was still kind of learning and piecing it together. But I knew in the back of my head that I didn't care for it, and so I kind of drilled down on her. I was like, okay, well, help me out, if why does it have such a bad rap? And she broke it down really straightforward. And she's like, listen, so many people conflate nuclear energy with nuclear weapons. And especially if you're talking to folks like our parents, and we're even me. I grew up in the somewhat Cold War era. And so, there is a disconnect between, or I don't know if disconnect's the right word, but basically there is a gap that exists. And you don't say, I want to use nuclear energy because, I think of nuclear weapons. I think of all the almost war stuff that we heard about in our youth. And I also think that what you're seeing today with folks like you and Jessica and Schellenberger and so many folks that are coming out of MIT, and essentially just the folks that are on the cutting edge of nuclear, that you're getting younger faces associated with it that didn't grow up with that. You know what I mean? You didn't grow up hearing about all this stuff. And I think that's helpful. I think that's going to be helpful in changing minds and quite frankly, changing discussions, because ideally some of those folks can talk to their parents or their grandparents, and hopefully, films like ours might, open up some eyeballs just as to listen, it's not as cut and dry as, big mushroom cloud scary, bad.
Right.
Don't do this.
Right. I hope that's this generation, I guess the Zoomers, have less baggage about this subject than the previous did. But you're right. It was, in the early days for the boomers, it was duck and cover, going into 3 Mile Island. Then, for Gen X, it was a little bit of the Cold War, but then Chernobyl. And then for my generation, millennials, it was The Simpsons. And just growing up, that was my understanding of nuclear power up until college. Was it's a non-starter because of the waste issues, and right. And
even the perception of the waste. It's like I didn't know what nuclear waste looked like until I did the film.
Yeah,
and that was something. We didn't have a big crew. We did a lot of our shooting with a skeleton crew. It was 4 of us. It was myself, a TP, another producer, and Robert. And I remember somehow we hit on the topic of nuclear waste and what the storage was in Indian Point, because we went to Indian Point. And Robert said, well, yeah, it's the rods, and it's 250,000 pounds. No, they can't still make a dirty bomb. I'm like, wait, what do you mean it's a rod? And it was between that conversation. And it was an article that Schellenberger wrote about, this perception of like the green liquid that's going to dip into the ground and then go into the water supply and everything else. It's just like, these aren't the same thing.
Nope.
They're very different.
Very different. Yeah, it took a video about molten salt reactors and potentially recycling waste for me to even entertain the idea of learning a bit more about it. I'm ashamed to say, I wish I could be one of those people that, oh yeah, I knew from day one or whatever, because I do meet those folks as well who, they had a dad in the Navy or worked at a power plant or something. They have the leg up on you. Well, that's great. Well, I have a couple clips from the movie, the trailer, and then about this topic of cannabis. If we want to get back to that part. Again, I'm sorry that you won't be able to watch it with the rest of us.
I actually can.
Got it on this. Okay.
I have 2 monitors, so yeah.
You don't have to rub it in here. I'm looking at my old monitor over there, but that's, that's what you get for having a girlfriend, I guess. Or fiance. She'll slap me if I say girl. No. All right. So would you like to start with the trailer first or the clip from?
Yeah, I think we can do the trailer first, and then talk a little bit about that, and then we can hit on that one section, if that's all right with you.
Sounds great. Yeah, let me just click play on it.
What if I told you all the things we care about can be tied back to one simple question? Can you turn your lights on in the morning? I'm Robert Bryce, and the way I see it, electricity explains the world. To prove it, we traveled 60,000 miles and interviewed dozens of people from 7 countries on 5 continents. Whether it's cryptocurrency in Iceland or marijuana cultivation in Colorado, the need for cheap, abundant electricity is critical.
You know, it's funny how we take things like electricity for granted.
We're talking health, wealth, climate change, even women's rights. Electricity is the great equalizer.
Now you have the problem that we have here in Puerto Rico.
We know that there are about 1.2 billion people in the world today who have no access to electricity at all.
If people have a choice between either no energy and dirty energy, they will take dirty energy every time.
What makes you think that Africans' need for power is inferior to an American's need for power?
Everywhere we went, we saw the same thing. Power equals power. But how are we going to plug in every person on the planet without killing the planet?
Reducing carbon emissions, fighting climate change is a big challenge, and you don't want to take anything off the table.
And you can marry dense fuel with human ingenuity. We can do nearly anything.
We have to plug them in now. It begins now.
Electricity does, in fact, explain the world. We're going to show you how.
Great. Wow, the sound design on that is amazing.
Thanks.
Yeah. Holy cow. It's like compared to our vocals just going back. Like Dolby surround.
Zoom doesn't has a mix studio yet.
No, they don't. Yeah, it does seem like, tangent. We can talk about video conferencing software's downfalls in the future. All right. Yeah, that's great. All right. Should we go to the next one?
Before, on the topic of the trailer, I will say this for any potential folks that want to watch the film, because please do watch the film. If it looks interesting to you, follow us on Facebook. It's just facebook.com/juicethemovie. My background, as I said, isn't in energy. I actually come from the trailer world, and my wife and I own a branded content company here in Austin. And what we tried to do was make the film palatable for my 70-year-old mom and my 13-year-old son, and for me, because I wasn't an energy person going into it. And so if you like the pace of that trailer, a lot of the film moves like that. You know, that we didn't, electricity is a dense subject. It's a heavy subject. And we didn't want it to take anyone to school. We wanted to make sure that people were entertained. So we had an insane crew that was very small, but it included, an Emmy winner from High Profits, an Emmy winner. Our DP was the DP for Deadliest Catch, and Emmy winner from Silas Height. What did he do? The food one on Netflix. But basically, we had a very tight crew, but the content looks and sounds really, really good. And hopefully that will help bridge the gap between heavy content that is actually entertaining. So
yeah, I'd agree. It looks extremely high budget. So I'm hopeful that, once it's released June 2nd, I'm going to do everything I can to push it out there and make sure people see this, because it is one of the best, if not the best, documentary on this subject that I've seen. Certainly. All right, should we look at the weed cannabis?
Yeah,
part
so
of it
this next one is it's the front end of the weed one. We're missing the very beginning of it. We have Robert basically climbing a hill to get up to the top of the hill at Chautauqua Park, and then he'll do a lead in, and then we cut just before we get into the black market part. So it's about 3.5 minutes long.
Okay, here we go.
Electricity does, in fact, explain the world. That's why I'm here in Boulder, Colorado, arguably the world capital of legal weed cultivation and retailing. Within about 5 miles of where I'm standing here in Chautauqua Park, there are about 12.5 legal weed dispensaries selling brands like Purple Haze. But to produce Purple Haze and other brands of cannabis sativa, they are using lots of electricity. In fact, marijuana cultivation is the world's single most electricity-intensive agricultural business. All over this town, entrepreneurs are busy turning watts into weed. We're looking for a dispensary. It's not that hard to find them, but there are about 20 of them in the city, or at least a dozen and a half of them. But yeah, we're bagging dispensaries, so to speak. All these buildings, they'll have big signs on them, but the grow operations don't have any signs, and they usually only have the street number. You just look at the exterior of the building, no signs, and look at the long electrical conduit lines that are on the outside. Look at the size of the three-phase conduit going into that gray box, and then how many meters they've got right behind it. That's all new conduit on the outside of the building. Why else would you need that much electricity in such a nondescript warehouse? Look at this. This is all brand new. This is new electrical service, 500 kilovolt amps. That's a brand new transformer put in just for a marijuana grow operation in this warehouse. Marijuana growers don't want people to know they're growing marijuana, but know what to look for. You can find them.
It's certainly keeping the energy company busy, upgrading transformers, all sorts of equipment upgrades like that are needed for high energy use facilities. Electricity used by the cannabis industry has been increasing sharply over the past several years. I believe the average has been about 34% per year.
The electricity intensity of marijuana cultivation is 23 times that of a hospital and about 130 times that of an average U.S. residence. That's a lot of juice. Want to know the real buzzkill? About half of Colorado's electricity comes from coal-fired power plants. As a result, Boulder dispensaries are required by city ordinance to prove they're growing polar bear-friendly ganja.
Colorado's had a number of different mandates and opportunities for using renewable technologies. So for example, I live in Boulder. I get my electricity from Xcel Energy. I can pay a little bit more to have that energy come from wind power. It's important for a lot of people because of politics and wealth to be able to feel like you're doing something environmental while you're living like everyone else does. It has not led to an appreciable decarbonization of the Colorado economy. A lot of the offsetting provisions, whether it's for the cannabis industry, for individual homeowners, it's simply accounting. The number that really matters is where does the energy come from? And so long as Colorado gets 85% of its energy from fossil fuels, 85% of the economic activity in Colorado is from fossil fuels, no matter which we assign to the 15% and which we assign to the 85%.
We're going to a black market grower in Denver. He has decided that it's far easier to operate in the black market and more profitable to do it in the black market than in the regulated market. Okay.
Fantastic. Nicely done, good sir. So good, I forgot to unmute my mic. Oh, man. Great. Yeah. So, one thing that was said that stuck out to me was the accounting tricks that happen. Was it Roger who said that?
Pilkey, yeah.
Pilkey Jr. Yeah. What do you think he meant by that? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, I listened to it a million different times. We were trying to figure out a way to show that, but he was saying think about it this way: if you are if you're trying to get legislation passed, and you want to come off as being an environmentalist that is also in favor of making your pro legal weed constituency happy, attaching a rider to legislation that says, okay, if you're going to grow marijuana, you got to make sure that it's carbon friendly, or you're going to have to buy carbon offsets. And it's essentially playing a game of squirrel, right? It's like, look over here, because as it's like you said, as long as 85% of the electricity generation in the state of Colorado comes from fossil fuels like coal and natural gas, that's where they're getting their energy from. It doesn't matter how many indulgences you may buy in the form of carbon credits, you're still hosing the environment, or maybe you're not hosing the environment. You're still doing the thing that you don't think you're doing because you're paying someone to make you feel good, right? Because the amount is the amount is the amount. No matter how you want to work the smoke and mirrors of saying you might be getting more from renewables. It just isn't the case, because 85% of the electricity generation in Colorado is coming from fossil fuels. And so that is what it is, no matter how you might pay your electric bill. If there's a box you can check. I'm sure you have them in Minnesota. We have them in Austin for sure. You can pay a little bit more, and you're something like a South Texas wind project might be helping make me feel a little bit better about it. But at the end of the day, I don't know what the fossil fuel pull is in Texas. I'm guessing it's pretty high, and the number is the number, no matter how we might want to massage our ego or our elections for using renewable energy.
So you're telling me that there isn't some kind of electron filter that sends the clean ones to my house and the dirty ones to someplace else?
The grid is the grid.
Yeah.
I mean, like the thing the grid has going for you is that it's constant. The grid is always up. And the last thing on the planet you'd ever want is some sort of electron filter, right? I think one of my hangups as it related to renewables, and I'm still in favor of solar. I think that it's come a long way, and there's a lot to be said of it. I'm skeptical on when, but that's a whole other discussion, right? I think the reason I am skeptical in general when it comes to certain renewables is because Pilkey has a great line. He says, "There is no silver bullet, there is silver buckshot." Certain things work in certain places. If you're in Iceland, hey man, you got geothermal and hydro. You can go 100% renewables all day long. You're in Costa Rica, same thing. You got wind and you got solar in a very big way. You can go 100%, but it doesn't work that way for everyone else. And what you run into is something that I like to call overbuilds. And this is like I wrote this whole thing. It's like the biggest issue with renewables, they require overbuilds. So imagine building and paying for a 3,000 square foot home, but you only need a 2,000 square foot home. You're going to use more material. You're going to take up more space. Managing and taking care of that space is going to be a burden. It's going to be more than you need, cost more than you want to spend, and you only get to run the AC when the sun is out. I mean, it's just baffling. It doesn't quite work that way. So there's a practicality side of it that, and that part I think gets left out of a lot of the equations. Is that if you have a wind farm somewhere, there is a fossil fuel backup or a nuclear backup. There is a backup of some sort, because they need constant. They need that constant flow, and and renewables by and large are asynchronous. Sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow, so you have issues.
And there can even be issues the other direction. If you're not able to curtail fast enough or dump electricity other places, then stuff starts on fire. We don't want that.
Right.
Great. Well, I think this might be a good time to promote our other guest into panelist status, Mr. John Kutch from the Thorium Energy Alliance. He is here for one big reason. It's actually Alvin Weinberg's birthday today, and if we don't know who Alvin Weinberg is, he was one of the scientists who helped develop the light water reactors that we use today, and also worked on something called the molten salt reactor, which is a liquid fueled reactor. So John, he's here with us now, and he's got a few slides to tell us about Mr. Alvin Weinberg. And I think I'm going to slide some windows. I'll get you out of the frame here, Tyson, so you can relax a little bit. And John, welcome. How are you?
So you're gonna mirror your screen? You got my slides I sent?
I do. Yep, I got them all projected up. They're looking great. I got the picture of Alvin right now. Yes, sirree.
Yep. And I'll just, before I start here, I'll have to take a giant handful of gummies here, make sure I'm all posted up.
There you go. That's funny.
Oh,
yeah. So I
can get through this talk before they hit.
I was gonna say, should have done that 20 minutes ago.
Yeah.
That's my built-in timer. When I stop making sense, Eric can cut me off.
Funny. I should say a little bit more to introduce you. I've known John for many years, since my very first Thorium Energy Alliance conference in, I think it was 2011, where as just a music student back then with an interest in climate change, I attended one. I checked out about $2,000, $3,000 worth of equipment from my college library, cameras and microphones and things like that, to help chronicle these events. And it was kind of my first foray into nuclear advocacy and climate advocacy at all. Before that point, I had been a little bit nihilistic about our chances. At that time, I had been a big fan of biofuels, ethanol in particular, and was coming to the realization that there's quite a few issues with those, and they're not quite the panacea they were sold to be. And once I got connected with the thorium community and learned a little bit more about advanced reactors, that actually got me to take another look at the reactors we use today as well. And throughout all that time, I ended up naming my cat after Alvin Weinberg here, who we're going to learn a little bit about today. Awesome. And 10 years ago today, I should also mention the BP oil spill happened. So it's something about this 420 day. It seems to have some historical alignments. But thanks, John, for being here. I'm going to let you tell us a bit about Alvin Weinberg, and then maybe we'll circle back the discussion with how we can decarbonize cannabis with the use of advanced reactors, if that sounds good to you guys. And I'll bring Tyson back in at that point. Sound good?
Yeah. So
okay, great.
Here's all of our buddies' favorite dude is we're looking at slide 1. I don't know if you're sharing the screen there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not, but anyways, Alvin, as a young Jewish kid, came to the University of Chicago, and back in the 1930s, they had a thing called the MET lab, so the metal lab, and they're just basically trying to understand the metallurgy of advanced metals. Stainless steel wasn't even that old then. The idea of making alloys had been around, but it was just hit or miss. You just sort of threw stuff into a pot and mixed it. And so they were really starting to take a scientific approach to this stuff. And so when they started the Manhattan Project at the University of Illinois, they recruited all the University of Chicago. They recruited all these Met Lab students because they knew the metallurgy and nuclear power is nothing more than the super advanced use of metals, right? So these guys were brought in, and it was an amazing time because you can imagine you had 24, 25-year-old guys that just 10 years later were running national labs. I mean, could you imagine having, you had a 32-year-old guy, in charge of a national lab. So people just shot up the ladder very quickly back then. The pictures you're looking at here are Alvin Weinberg was credited. He's the only guy that was credited with both the patent for the light water reactor and the patent for the molten salt reactor. And so, he and a large group of smart fellas had come up with hundreds and hundreds of reactor concepts, but the two that he was most known for, the light water reactor for a long time became the reactor of the Navy, and the molten salt reactor was unfortunately sidelined. But at the time in the 50s, especially the early 50s, they thought this is the kind of reactor you need in order to have a civilian nuclear power, because civilians need power and the military needs uranium and plutonium for weapons. They don't need the power as much. And if they do have power, they can use light water because they're going to put it on a boat, and the boat is surrounded by water, so they never be without coolant, right? Whereas a molten salt reactor had the inherent properties of if it got too hot, it would shut itself down. If you left it alone, it would eventually just freeze on its own, and lots of attributes such as that. But he went ahead and after 10 years of research, they took about 5 years and built the molten salt reactor experiment. And you can see there 6,000 full power hours. They really ran it. It really run. So it's not a paper reactor. It's not a fantasy. These, we can do this again. So if you go up to page 2 there, just quickly, he got fired from his job as director of Oak Ridge National Lab because he was endlessly hounding the Nixon administration to increase the role of safety for reactor designs. And the reason he did that is he and a bunch of people were super afraid of the breeder reactor. The breeder reactor, the way they were executing it was very problematic, and so they did not enjoy that in the administration, and they decided to. It wasn't just Alvin; everybody's ox got bored. Lead-cooled reactors, helium-cooled reactors, aqueous, any interesting reactor got sidelined for the breeder reactor program. So you can see a picture of him there. He lived pretty long. He lived in just before I got into this subject matter into 2006. But there's a scale model there of the molten salt reactor experiment. And let's just go to page 3 real quick. Just to finish the story, after he got fired, he sort of wandered in the wilderness. He helped run the Department of Energy, the Atomic Energy Commission, and he was miserable. He said it was the closest to suicide he'd ever gotten. And later on, the book that he wrote, the most famous book he wrote was The Second Nuclear Era. And he is very philosophical about that someday a new generation will come along and actually execute the plan that he and folks like Glenn Seaborg and even President Kennedy wanted to. And you can see that illustration on this image, how elegantly simple this system is. It's just he used to say, give me a pot, a pump, and a pipe, and I'll give you a reactor. And you don't even really need the pump. These reactors, a lot of the designs that I've helped on recently, you could even consider using natural circulation, which would make it even yet safer, because now you basically have a lava lamp of nearly infinite energy. So that would be a nice, a nice new way to approach generating power. I mentioned Kennedy real quick there. President Kennedy saw the advancement of civilian nuclear power coming down the pike, and he said, well, what should civilian nuclear power look like? And he had Glenn Seaborg do a great study on it, and you can find it on the Thorium Energy Alliance website. And the study basically said, well, we've done a really good job with the military reactors. We're excellent at making uranium and plutonium and all that, but what we have to do now is make a civilian reactor, and that should be a reactor powered by thorium, because it's more abundant and it's nearly impossibly difficult to turn into a weapon, and it should be a molten salt reactor because of the attributes I stated earlier. It's the fact that it's essentially a self-managing reactor system. So, and the page 4 gives you some of the other attributes, and that leads us to what you wanted to talk about, Eric. So what you're looking at on your left there is the dump tanks, and these are the famous dump tanks that people talk about. The nice thing about a molten salt reactor is if you lose power, if you lose island power, you're never going to have a Fukushima thing. You're never going to have a Chernobyl. You're never going to have 3 Mile Island with a molten salt reactor, because if you need to, in the end, you can push all the salt out of a molten salt reactor. You can let it stay in the molten salt reactor. You might wreck it, but it's not going to melt down. It's not going to explode. It doesn't run at pressure. There's no water splitting into hydrogen and oxygen and getting ready to explode. But if you have the opportunity, if you see something coming down the pike, like a tidal wave, for instance, you can actually push all the salt out of your reactor into these dump tanks there. And in the dump tanks, you'll get rid of the excess heat from the reactivity heat. You can collect the reactivity gases and let them dissipate their heat elsewhere, and you can filter all that. And essentially, when it's safe, you can push the fuel salt back into the reactor. And then the other really great thing that the picture on the right shows in abundance is that is the radiator from the molten salt reactor. So they didn't generate power, they were just throwing it away. But that shows you that is 650 degrees salt, Celsius salt. And a nuclear reactor today can do about 280 degrees Celsius. When you can make 2.5 times more thermal energy, you get into electricity generating systems that get into the 50% range. But think about that, a nuclear reactor or a coal-fired reactor is 33, maybe 43, somewhere in that percent. If you can get into the 45, 50%, that's great. But really, why would you throw away half your energy to make electricity? Let solar and wind have that. If they want to make electricity so bad, let them have it. It's the worst market in the world. What you can do if you're making 650 degree Celsius thermal heat is you can do 95% of all industrial processes in the world. So you can make plastics, you can make cement, you can make directly reduced iron, you can make vast amounts of hydrogen and have the hydrogen economy. And I have to promote thorium a little bit. And I'm a kind of a believer that if you're going to do that, you can do it with uranium. Great, everyone loves uranium, and you could do it with plutonium.
Do they? I mean, I do, but
but you can also use plutonium in these molten salt reactors. You can use waste or spent fuel. Anybody would call it spent fuel, and there's a lot of things you can do it. But thorium has the one great benefit to me, in that you get it for free. There's no such thing as a thorium mine, right? And there's no such thing as highly enriched thorium. There's just garbage thorium that you get when you're mining steel or titanium or phosphates for fertilizer. You get it for free, and right now it's a hazardous waste that we got to figure out what to do with. I got something we can do with. We can make vast amounts of energy for a prosperous future. And then the last slide is just a scale for you guys. And if you want any of these slides, they're available on the website. You can just pick through. We got a huge library, and it's growing by hundreds of images every month. But this is a slide I did to help somebody understand how much, if we want a hydrogen economy, how much hydrogen do we need, right? So you're not going to make this level. This is the United States daily use. If we change from liquid fuels, if we could make gasoline, ethanol, and diesel from hydrogen, and we captured carbon from the atmosphere, how much would we need every day? And so, so look at that's the daily amount: 392 million kilograms of hydrogen per day, 27 million kilograms, 235 million kilograms of hydrogen a day. And that doesn't come free. If you're splitting hydrogen from water, you're going to need 1.5 billion gallons of pure water a day. And that would mean you're going to use about 3 billion gallons of highly purified water. And then you're going to have to purify it further into deionized water before you put it through one of these cracking columns or a proton exchange membrane. So that is a tremendous amount of energy to make the water, energy to crack the water, energy to capture the carbon. And when gasoline has 110 to 120,000 BTUs per gallon, that means you've actually got to generate about 500,000 BTUs per gallon to get that. That energy doesn't come from nowhere, right? And so curtailed wind, you're not going to get it from there. If you want a hydrogen economy, it's going to take 1,400 megawatt thermal reactors just for the United States to do that. So we could go into it more, but that sort of leads back to what if you want carbon-free marijuana? You know, well, you can credit the marijuana for about 20 minutes that it's collecting some carbon, but a lot of it's going right back into the atmosphere. But if we talk about lighting and power and harvesting and HVAC systems, that's a discussion I would love to have.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's. I got Tyson back in here and our stream. Thank you for that, John. All right. So let's talk about that for a second. Obviously, you know, there's we got a lot more to decarbonize than just the cannabis industry, but this is it's a good opportunity to talk about it at least. You think if you can decarbonize cannabis, then I think you're also decarbonizing agriculture, at least the growing parts of it, right? Talk me through what. So, John, give me your 3-step plan if you're going to decarbonize cannabis. How would you do it?
I actually worked for the National Renewable Energy Lab for a while, and one of the things we used to talk about was carbon capture, you know, as you can imagine. And so one of the things we actually talked about, not marijuana so much, but making these huge greenhouses like they have up in Canada, and then they're like, oh, we'll pump the exhaust from gas turbines into these huge greenhouses, and we'll let the plants suck them in. And then that's one quick way to realize the scale of your emissions. When you realize, you know, you'd have to have a greenhouse the size of Manitoba to absorb the carbon. So carbon capture is an unbelievably fraught thing, and it's just you are not going. Let me just cut to the chase. You're not capturing carbon. You're not going to capture carbon from coal plants or jet engines or turbines. You have to get that notion out of your head.
Iceland might disagree with you a little bit, but not a lot of countries would. Tyson, did you talk to? Because I think they have been pumping stuff pumping some carbon in the ground, right, in Iceland.
Yeah, we have. Bryce and John are on the same page as it relates to carbon capture, and Bryce is like, "This is bullshit," you know. So his I mean, he probably has a more articulate answer than that. But yeah, we didn't dig into a lot of carbon capture just because of the numbers. You know, I mean, yeah, Iceland's an anomaly. You know, it's a small island. There are 300,000 people on it. You know, it's a little bit different when you think about the fact that there are 3.2 billion people in the world today that use less electricity than an American refrigerator. You know, that's 30 times the population of the United States. So yeah, carbon capture wasn't something we did a lot of digging on.
And you can, you know, when you're talking about that, that's energy density of the population. So you got 300,000 people on, let's say, 300,000 square miles or something like that. Yeah. If you got New York City, where exactly is this carbon capture going to take place? And this is, you're talking to a guy who actually, I actually think some of the work being done by companies like Carbon Engineering is very interesting, and Bill Gates has invested in the company. And what that is they have these gigantic walls. You know, basically it looks like a giant radiator, and what they do is they sort of have they have a fluid that loves carbon dioxide, and the fluid collects the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then they use essentially a very hot oven and a kiln to suck the carbon back out of the fluid and turn it into basically limestone, for lack of a more sophisticated example. But there is a way to do it, but even Carbon Engineering wants to locate next to a hydroelectric dam, because their other option is to burn natural gas, and then half of their carbon capture would be their own gas, you know, and the amount of kit, the amount of kit it takes, when you're doing the scrubbing. I mean, when we scrub for sulfur out of coal plants, that's a huge and heavy lift, but we can do it, and that's what carbon capture guys point to. But it's like, we had a thing in Illinois called Future Gen, and we actually did some work on Future Gen, and they were going to capture the carbon and turn it into gypsum. And I'm like, this one plant would make enough gypsum to have wallboard for the entire Midwest. And this is 150 megawatt plant. If you had 10, 15,000 megawatts or gigawatts of power being carbon captured, what would you do with it? You're going to pump it into the ground. The most economic thing to do with it when you're pumping it into the ground is to use it to extract more oil.
That's funny you bring that up. So in Juice, we didn't talk about carbon capture. In our next film that we've shot like 16 interviews so far for our next film, we spoke with Justin Ong from ClearPath, and that's what he talked about. He talked about, listen, one of the best uses of it is actually, being more efficient with oil. It's great for pushing it back up to the top. He goes, but then, it's an interesting balance because you're essentially pulling out more fossil fuels, which are going to emit more carbon. So yeah, I think it's a scale issue, and it's interesting.
I'm an engineer, so I know we're not going to stop using gasoline overnight or fossil fuels. And so I think one of the greatest things you could do with thermonuclear hydrogen, heat and hydrogen, is to co-locate with like a giant refinery like in Whiting, Indiana. And you would, right now, people don't realize about 30 to 40% of all the oil is burned to refine the oil, right? And so what if we could actually use 100% of the oil that we sucked out of the ground, and we would use the heat from a nuclear reactor to crack the oil, and we'd use the hydrogen to uprate the oil. And so we would get, instead of 25 gallons of oil from a barrel of 40 gallons, we'd get 40 gallons or maybe even 55 because we're uprating it with some hydrogen. So, I mean, trying to stay on topic with the cannabis, those guys, those guys' issue is what you brought up earlier. I love the idea that you say, that essentially you've got libertarians, which are pot smoking Republicans, and then you got tree hugger Gaia lovers, and they both want to smoke their pot, and they want to smoke it all year long, and from greenhouses and grow houses. And it's like, so I love the fact that you put the thumb screws on them and say, hey, you want this is the filthiest plant on planet Earth. Strawberries from Argentina in the middle of February make more sense than this stuff. What are you gonna do about it? And so that is an excellent thing to beat. You should ring that bell every chance you get. And that a huge weight is on their shoulders to switch their lighting, improve their HVAC, do the same thing that server farms are now starting to get much more efficient. What's more wasteful than a server farm so you can watch a freaking cat video? You should be ashamed of yourself. And then, so
the thing is, we're not gonna fix this with shaming people and guilting them, unfortunately, as fun as it might be. But I have thought about that though, because consumer preferences could, in the near term, help curb some emissions. And if we can't get a carbon tax or a carbon fee done, I mean, how about a carbon label? Like a lot of people don't know the difference between beef and chicken and lentils. They don't understand the huge variation in greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with those different types of food. And I think if that was on the package, people would make choices with that in mind. You got your regular burgers, you got your Impossible burgers, like that. If all things equal elsewise or close, that might change your decision.
There's a one of the things that Tyson was speaking about a little bit earlier was this idea that like carbon offsets are ridiculous, but one thing that is, you know, a way to do a little jujitsu on that is that we could actually, the guy's name is escaping me at the moment, but there's a fella in Germany who has set up a mark-off for nuclear power on electric bills. So just the way you get your electric bill, and it's like, do you want 100% renewable? And you can check to, you know, fine yourself $50 a month. Well, this guy started doing that, and they're fighting the hell out of him because they're realizing his nuclear-only electricity is cheaper than the other electricities, and people are like, hey, give me only a nuclear power. And in Germany, you can imagine how fraught that is. But that guy is doing excellent work, and I have toyed with the idea of trying to get ComEd here in Illinois to put a nuclear checkoff and say, hey, you know, 60% of power, not just renewable power, but 60% of power in Illinois at times is from nuclear. I want it 100%, you know, even if it's a specious lie, like you pointed out, Tyson. You know, electrons are electrons. But if I want to be able to say, hey, I want 100% nuclear, you know, all the time.
There's a company in Sweden that's doing that right now, Carnful, and they're working on rolling it out in the UK then. And as I understand it, that may be a stepping stone to bringing that kind of service to the United States as well. So could be, you know, coming to an electricity bill near you, hopefully. All right, I'm gonna try to bring this into the station a little bit by
one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things that we worked on, just to address your carbon cannabis very directly, is we worked on co-locating with the state of Wyoming, making a nuclear energy industrial park, and that's the sort of thing that you could do for cannabis. You could have high-grade heat going to make hydrogen, and then a little lower-grade heat going to make steel or petroleum products, and then the low-grade heat could be used to maintain the temperature inside grow houses, and then it goes back to the reactor to go through again. So there is a possibility. It's not near term, I'll admit that, but you know, I think the Chinese are going to have their thorium molten salt reactor running in the next 6 months to a year, and hopefully somebody in the West will have one running, you know, in 3 to 5 to 6 years after that. So there's hope. We got to work like hell. We have to be not patient, and I think we can start to be smart about power like that.
Yeah, I agree. That would be an elegant way to solve a lot of problems that we have. So I would be remiss if I didn't highlight a couple things. One is that this documentary John and some friends worked very hard to bring to Amazon Prime is available now. What are you doing? You're locked in your house anyway. Go to Amazon Prime, watch Thorium, The Far Side of Nuclear, watch one of my heroes, Alvin Weinberg, in cartoon form, drinking whiskey throughout the entire thing. And enjoy that film. Fantastic. Also, Juice, mark your calendar, June 2nd. It's your first opportunity to watch that movie online, and watch it. You should. It's a tremendous film, extremely entertaining. I know sometimes people think, documentaries, you know, let's watch Avengers or something instead. But this one is nonstop action, insightful conversations, and some really impactful interviews, I thought, throughout it. So definitely watch that. And then a little more near-term stuff just throughout the week here. And this is kind of some small print, but we'll be sending this out in an email as well. I just wanted to highlight a few things. Department of Energy's got a webinar tomorrow about advanced nuclear. There's a Nuclear Regulatory Commission call on the future of Indian Point. We've been talking a lot about Indian Point lately. Indian Point is actually featured in Juice as well. Mayor Knickerbocker's in there. She's a former guest on the Clean Power Hour as well. But you can actually call in. This is at 12 o'clock Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, to the NRC meeting. We'll post the details in the chat and weigh in. There's a Q&A session at the end. We can make public comment. And of course, we want as many nuclear advocates, climate advocates who care about this to call in and make their voice heard. Then there's a couple other things throughout the week. A teach-in by the Nuclear New York guys at 3 p.m. on Thursday. We're going to be doing another Clean Power on Saturday. This one will be focused on art and music. I'll be singing some songs. We'll have Baba Brinkman, who wrote the Rap Guide to Climate Chaos and has been working on a nuclear tune. He'll be around and performing. Some writers will be joining us as well. And then on the 30th, this is still a little bit TBD on the final details here, but there's going to be a vigil at a gas plant that's going for Indian Point at a gas plant that's going to be a lot busier after they shut down Unit 2 here in New York. So if you can attend that, that's great. If not, we are planning on streaming their vigil there and holding a worldwide vigil in solidarity of the loss of over 2 gigawatts of always on clean power at this time. So mark your calendar for those and stay tuned. Guys, thank you again for joining me. Really appreciate it. I think we had a great discussion. Stay in touch and stay safe out there. Really, really appreciate it. So
thanks so much, guys.
Yeah, you bet. All right. Well, take care, fellas. And thanks to everybody who watched the stream. And we'll end it there.